The 10,208 meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Yemen to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting: Mr. Hans Grundberg, Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Yemen, and Mr. Tom Fletcher, Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Hans Grundberg.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, Yemen today faces a more serious risk of a return to large-scale conflict than at any point since the 2022 UN-mediated truce. There has been an intensification of military activity along front lines with recent attacks by Ansar Allah in Marib, Hadramaut, Mocha, and beyond, causing casualties among both military personnel and civilians. With regional trade and energy flows already under intense pressure from the crisis in the Strait of Hormuz, Ansar Allah's renewed attacks on commercial vessels in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, which the Council condemned in its recent statement, risk deepening Yemen's entanglement with a wider regional confrontation. These attacks also put seafarers' lives at risk. 2 days ago, a missile attack on a vessel killed several crew members. Tension had already been mounting prior to these developments. In July, an unauthorized flight from Tehran towards Sana'a was followed by airstrikes on Sana'a airport and missile attacks on Abha airport and oil facilities in Saudi Arabia. Madam President, I want to be clear about what Yemen stands to lose on this trajectory. For 4 years, and well beyond its formal expiry, the truce kept Yemen's front lines relatively quiet. Remarkably, even through the regional turmoil since 2023, this calm mostly held inside Yemen, giving civilians the most sustained respite since the start of the conflict. But as I have repeatedly emphasized, the truce was designed as a means, not an end. Its primary objective was to open the way to negotiations on a comprehensive settlement of the conflict. The parties did engage on a roadmap to that end, but that effort stalled following the regional escalation in 2023 and ultimately did not mature into a political process. Absent progress on the political process, the calm ushered in by the truce cannot hold indefinitely. A return to large-scale fighting in Yemen now would come at an unforgiving moment. With Yemen's state institutions fragmented by over a decade of conflict, its economy left with little margin to absorb another shock, and the wider region engulfed by war. For Yemenis, renewed war would once again place every ordinary ambition to study, to work, to build a life at the mercy of the fighting. It would mean a new generation sent to front lines, instead of having the chance to reimagine and remake their country's future. For this Council and the wider international community, it would mean one more conflict reignited in a region already aflame. Madam President, perilous as this moment is, I am convinced that a negotiated off-ramp remains possible. In recent weeks, I have been engaging intensively with the Yemeni parties with the support of regional actors, including on several trips to Riyadh and Muscat. I have been proposing ways to reverse the escalation and forge a credible path to a political solution. The government of Yemen and Ansar Allah have already identified many of the required elements, and these are also familiar to the Council. My office also regularly consults diverse Yemenis, including civil society and women's groups. Any way forward must address their priorities and those of the wider Yemeni public. First, The parties must immediately de-escalate and work towards a robust ceasefire. The calm along Yemen's front lines must be restored. Attacks and threats against shipping must stop, and freedom of navigation in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden must be upheld. Cross-border attacks must stop. A mechanism for managing incidents and de-escalation already exists. Military representatives from the government and Ansar Allah, together with the Saudi-led Joint Force Command, have previously met under the United Nations auspices through the Military Coordination Committee. I urge them to make full use of this channel, and I also repeat my call on the parties to respect their obligations to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure. The parties must also protect Yemen from being drawn further into the vortex of the already complex regional dynamics. Through de-escalation, they need to prioritize Yemen's own national interests. I have stressed this imperative in all my engagements. The second requirement is economic de-escalation. Yemen's economy has itself become a front line with salaries, currency, trade, revenues, transport, and essential services increasingly politicized. Addressing these issues will require the parties to negotiate arrangements in which they have more to gain from cooperation than confrontation. Resuming oil exports with appropriate security guarantees for production and export infrastructure would provide a critical source of income and support, and would also support the country's recovery. Yemenis must be able to move freely across the country, and the parties should agree on measures to resume commercial flights to and from Sana'a airport. This was possible under the 2022 truce, and it can and should be possible again. Commercial vessels must continue to reach Yemeni ports, delivering the food and other essential goods Yemenis depend on. The parties will also need to negotiate durable arrangements on the economic issues that touch Yemenis' daily lives more directly, including the payment of civil servant salaries and the restoration of essential services. The third requirement is sustained engagement with the United Nations to consolidate these gains and relaunch an inclusive Yemeni-owned political process. This remains the only credible path to comprehensively ending the conflict, ensuring that differences are resolved through dialogue rather than force, and establishing legitimate and accountable institutions that reflect Yemen's political and social diversity. We can turn this plan into reality, but mediation cannot substitute for political will. The Yemeni parties must choose dialogue, and they have every reason to do so. No party controls where escalation leads. The only certainty is that the Yemeni people will pay the price. Negotiations demand compromise, but the parties can shape their course. And it is the Yemeni people who stand to gain. Madam President, before closing, I would like to update the Council on two other matters. First, you will recall that in May, the parties agreed under UN auspices to release more than 1,600 conflict-related detainees. Preparations to implement the releases are progressing, albeit slowly, and I am concerned that the wider escalation could stall this process further. The parties have reaffirmed their commitment to me, and I welcome these assurances. Yet, commitment needs to translate into implementation. I urge the parties to cooperate with the International Committee of the Red Cross to complete the remaining technical and operational preparations as swiftly as possible. Second, for far too long, 73 United Nations personnel, alongside colleagues from non-governmental organizations, civil society, and diplomatic missions, have been arbitrarily detained by Ansar Allah. Despite sustained United Nations efforts to find a solution, we have yet to see progress towards their releases. And I urge this Council to maintain its attention and use every available avenue to influence to help secure their immediate and unconditional release. Madam President, 4 years of calm can be lost in a few weeks of escalation. I am not asking this Council today merely for statements of support. I am asking every member with influence over the parties to use it to steer Yemen away from the battlefield and back to the negotiation table. Thank you very much.
Mr. Grundberg for his briefing, and I now give the floor to Mr. Tom Fletcher.
Thank you, Madam President, and I thank, of course, the Special Envoy for his sobering briefing and his tireless efforts to advance a political path for Yemen. So this is OCHA's 6th briefing to this Council this year on Yemen, and I wish I could report a more positive shift, but the trajectory of the humanitarian crisis, I'm afraid, remains unchanged. Hunger is rising, health services are crumbling, families have exhausted their last coping mechanisms. And now the convergence of climate shocks and renewed regional tension threatens to deepen this catastrophe. More than a decade into this conflict, millions of Yemenis face impossible daily choices: food or medicine, education or work, survival or displacement. And I'm afraid the toll on women and girls is particularly alarming. Nearly 11 million women and girls require humanitarian support, and that includes 5.5 million women of reproductive age and over 750,000 pregnant women. Essential care for them is out of reach. 4 out of every 5 women lack access to life-saving reproductive health services. With only 1 in 5 health facilities providing maternal care, the cost is lethal. 3 women die every day from preventable pregnancy-related complications. And the health system is at a breaking point. Facilities lack basic supplies and personnel. Disease outbreaks are surging. In Marib alone, authorities have declared a health emergency due to a measles outbreak, the second highest case count globally this year. Madam President, food insecurity is worsening. Over half the population is experiencing acute food insecurity. 6 million people, the highest number globally, face emergency levels of deprivation, bordering on famine. In June, over 60% of households reported inadequate food consumption, a trend affecting every single governorate. While these statistics are staggering, they must not numb us. This unacceptable severity cannot become the new norm. The drivers are clear: regional tensions inflating prices, economic decline eroding livelihoods, and a critical shortfall in humanitarian funding. And meanwhile, I'm afraid that a new threat is emerging. El Niño conditions forecast a 40% reduction in rainfall across key agricultural areas. This will devastate crops, water availability, and rural livelihoods, compounding the impacts of extreme heat and water stress in a country already one of the most vulnerable to climate change. Madam President, access remains a significant hurdle. As you've heard, 73 UN colleagues remain detained by the Houthi de facto authorities, along with workers and former workers from NGOs, civil society, diplomatic missions. Their families live with uncertainty every day. Their release is more than an institutional demand. It is an appeal to our shared humanity. Let them return safely to their families, and let us create the environment in which support and services can be accessed by those most in need, safely, independently, impartially. Between July last year and July this year, over 200 humanitarian access incidents were recorded across the country. Interference, violence against staff, movement restrictions continue to impede, delay, constrain relief operations. Ahead of the UN General Assembly, I will be laying out critical access asks for crises across the world and the specific areas and people that we can reach if we remove these barriers. Madam President, we know that aid saves lives. In 2025, we reached an average of 5.3 million people monthly in Yemen. However, funding shortages, fueled by uncertainty and a lack of confidence, have now crippled our operations. With the humanitarian appeal barely 20% funded, the calculation is simple. When funding drops, rations are cut, clinics close, and protection services disappear. So I thank our largest donors, the European Commission, Saudi Arabia, the UK, Germany, and South Korea, and those supporting the Yemen Humanitarian Fund and the Central Emergency Response Fund. I've just allocated $10 million in initial SURF funding for food security. But this is just a stopgap. It's not a solution. So my three asks of you today, firstly, to donors. Provide flexible, predictable funding now. We have the capacity to deliver. We need the resources to bridge this chasm between desperate need and the current support we are getting. Secondly, to all parties, protect civilians, ensure principled humanitarian action. Specifically, I call again for the immediate, safe release of the 73 UN colleagues, as well as the NGO and civil society workers currently detained by the Houthi de facto authorities. Their families and our shared humanity demand their return. Third and finally, to this Council, please maintain your focus on Yemen. Your unity and advocacy are essential to prevent further suffering and to secure space for genuine progress. The people of Yemen have shown extraordinary resilience, but resilience can never be an excuse for the world to demand that they simply endure more. They deserve, and we must ensure they get, dignity, opportunity, and hope. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Fletcher for his briefing, and I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
I thank Special Envoy Grundberg and Under-Secretary General Fletcher. In recent weeks, we have seen a serious escalation in violence in Yemen and the wider region as a result of reckless Houthi actions. This includes drone and missile strikes against Saudi Arabia, attacks on international shipping in the Red Sea, and violations of Yemeni airspace by Iranian aircraft. Iran must cease its long-standing support for the Houthis, which threatens Yemen's stability. We express our condolences to those who have been killed or injured as a result of these actions, including Yemeni, Pakistani, and Indonesian nationals. Last week, this Council delivered a clear message of condemnation for Houthi actions and a call for de-escalation. We urge the Houthis to focus on efforts to achieve peace and alleviate the suffering of Yemenis, rather than seeking to embroil Yemen in a wider regional conflict. The United Kingdom reiterates its unwavering commitment to the sovereignty and security of Yemen, Saudi Arabia, and broader regional stability. Secondly, the recent escalation is compounding an already dire humanitarian situation. More than 22 million people require humanitarian assistance, over 18 million face food insecurity, and more than 2.2 million children under 5 are acutely malnourished. As a country heavily dependent on food and fuel imports, Yemen remains particularly vulnerable to further shocks. With humanitarian funding under strain and the Food and Agriculture Organization warning of drought risks and greater food insecurity, a return to large-scale conflict would turn an already dire situation into a catastrophe. The United Kingdom will continue to work with partners to support the humanitarian response, building upon the more than $180 million of UK funding last year for life-saving humanitarian assistance. We also remain deeply concerned by the Houthis' continued detention of 73 UN staff and many more NGO and civil society personnel, many who have been held for over 2 years. The Houthis must immediately and unconditionally release all those detained and allow humanitarian actors to operate safely and without obstruction. Third, the United Kingdom welcomes the appointment of Dr. Afra al-Zuba as Yemen's first female foreign minister. We look forward to working with her and the wider government of Yemen to support their efforts to deliver much-needed reforms and to strengthen security and stability, including through the new Yemen National Development Strategy. President, the choices made now will determine whether Yemen moves closer to peace or slips back towards deeper conflict and humanitarian crisis. The United Kingdom remains steadfast in its support for the role of the UN Special Envoy and an intra-Yemeni peace process under UN auspices to help build the peaceful future that Yemenis deserve. Thank you.
United Kingdom, and then I give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Gracias.
Thank you, Madam President.
we thank the Special Envoy of the Secretary-General for Yemen, Mr. Hans Grundberg, and Under Secretary-General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, Mr. Tom Fletcher. We thank them both for their invaluable briefings and for their tireless efforts to discharge their respective mandates. Moreover, we welcome the representative of Yemen to this chamber. The humanitarian situation that has been described in tragic terms by Mr. Tom Fletcher is particularly critical if we look at what's going on, and also a source of even greater depression if we look towards the future and how it might play out. President, we note with grave concern and condemn in the strongest terms the recent escalation in violence perpetrated by the Houthis. This has included acts against Yemeni armed forces in Hadramawt and Marib, and the use of drones against infrastructure in Saudi Arabia, as well as attacks on civilian objects and internally displaced persons camps in Marib in the regions of Mocha and Hodeidah. There, regrettably, lives have been claimed and individuals have been wounded. It is a source of particularly grave concern to note that facilities linked to energy supply and port areas have been targeted by these actions. This is a practice which regrettably seems to be becoming the norm in recent conflicts, and a practice whose consequences move beyond the local sphere. At the same time, this escalation is imperiling the truce negotiated under the auspices of the United Nations in 2022 and threatens to once again plunge Yemen into a widespread, large-scale conflict. A new escalation in violence is something that Yemen, the region, and the international community can ill afford. Madam President, the resumption of attacks against commercial vessels in the Red Sea, as well as actions which affect navigation in the Strait of Hormuz and the surrounding area, are entirely unacceptable situations which, as has been tragically demonstrated by the most recent among them, have claimed innocent lives and laid bare the grave human cost of such behavior. These acts not only imperil the lives of seafarers and the freedom of navigation, they also move beyond the sea because they endanger global supply chains, international trade, and energy security. And this has direct repercussions on both economies and the daily lives of people in all countries. And these effects are particularly serious and disproportionate in the global south and the most vulnerable economies. In light of the above, and recognizing that the measures adopted by this Council have proven insufficient in terms of preventing these actions from continuing, we reiterate our appeal for absolute compliance with relevant Council resolutions, as well as with the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Moreover, we demand the immediate cessation of any act, threat, or attack on commercial vessels liable to interrupt, imperil, or stymie the freedom and safety of maritime navigation. Madam President, regrettably, all of the above is having a direct impact on the people of Yemen. For more than a decade, the Yemeni people have watched as their living conditions have worsened and have seen how a protracted conflict leaves deep wounds on a humanitarian, economic, and social level. More than 53% of Yemen's people, approximately 18 million people, are suffering grave food insecurity. Among this 18 million, 2.2 million are under 5, and 1.3 million are pregnant women, pregnant or breastfeeding women, and they are suffering acute malnutrition. These are not merely figures. We're talking here about millions of lives that are paying the price for a crisis which rumbles on. Since we took up our seat as an elected member of this council, figures reported by OCHA have continued to increase and have produced increasingly alarming forecasts. Every new figure is a reminder that civilians are enduring the consequences of a crisis that is dragging on without any solution being found, and it seems no hope is on the horizon. We cannot allow Yemen to continue on this spiral. We cannot normalize millions of people going hungry while violence rages on. Consequently, this crisis demands a response commensurate with its gravity. It is not sufficient to extend the decisive support of the Security Council. We need to see the commitment of the international community in its entirety. This must take the form of adequate humanitarian financing and joint and coordinated measures which make it possible to meet the most urgent needs, protect the civilian population, and lay the foundations for a lasting peace. Thank you.
Representative of Panama for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Liberia.
Madam President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the A3, namely the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Somalia, and my own country, Liberia. We thank Special Envoy Hans Grundberg and Undersecretary General Tom Fletcher for their briefings. We welcome the permanent representative of Yemen to this meeting. The A3 is deeply alarmed by the severe deterioration of Yemen's security landscape. Developments over recent weeks demonstrate once again Yemen faces a greater risk of renewed large-scale conflict today than at any point since the April 2022 truce. The renewed escalation risks reversing years of relative calm, undermining the United Nations-led political process and inflicting further suffering upon the Yemeni people. Yemen must not become a theater for broader regional confrontation. In this regard, the A3 highlights the following points. First, the A3 reiterates its unwavering support for the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Yemen. We also note this Council's press statement further affirming Yemen's sovereignty over its airspace and that all flights must be pre-approved by the government of Yemen. The future of Yemen must be written by Yemeni hands through an inclusive UN-led process. In this regard, we reaffirm our strong support for the efforts of Special Envoy Hans Grundberg and the UN-led political process. We urge all parties to move beyond mere conflict management and commit to addressing root causes. Peace cannot simply be managed. It must be built on the bedrock of genuine dialogue. Second, we are deeply concerned by the renewed escalation in Yemen. The fighting across Merab and Hadramaut shows how rapidly hard-won gains vanish. We are alarmed by reports of attacks since early August, including shelling of civilian areas and a large displacement camp in Merab city that shelters more than 2 million displaced persons, resulting in civilian casualties and injuries. When military force replaces diplomacy, it is always innocent civilians who bear the cost. We demand full compliance with international humanitarian law, particularly the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution. Cross-border strikes against the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, attacks on energy infrastructure, and declared maritime blockades threaten to internationalize the conflict. Regional actors must exercise influence responsibly. Internally, we encourage all actors in Aden and the southern governorates to resolve political tensions through dialogue to preserve institutional cohesion. Third, as we continue to be told, the humanitarian and economic situation in Yemen remains extremely grave, with devastating impact on women and girls in Yemen, with nearly 11 million women and girls requiring humanitarian assistance, including 5.5 million of reproductive age, 750,000 pregnant women. 4 in 5 lacking reproductive care face dire risks, contributing to 3 preventable maternal deaths every day. Meanwhile, a healthcare system collapse has fueled outbreaks like measles surge in Mirab, with over 1,600 cases and 12 deaths. Strikes on Al-Makal port on 9, 10, and 11th August damaged piers, commercial goods, and food supplies, directly choking vital imports. Humanitarian aid is a lifeline for millions, not a bargaining chip for war. We call for full, safe, and unhindered humanitarian assets, flexible funding, and economic stabilization. Crucially, the A3 remains deeply concerned by the continued detention of United Nations personnel, humanitarian workers, NGO staff, civil society representatives, and personnel associated with diplomatic missions by the Houthis. This month marks 2 years since the initial wave of mass detentions that affected personnel working in support of humanitarian development and diplomatic efforts across Yemen. We demand their immediate, unconditional release of all detainees. The A3 welcomes the recent UN brokered agreement to release over 1,600 conflict-related detainees as a positive step forward to building trust when confidence is scarce. We call on all parties to ensure full, safe, rapid, unhindered humanitarian access and to protect humanitarian personnel, assets, while facilitating the safe movement of workers and supplies. Humanitarian assistance must not be politicized, diverted, or obstructed. We further urge the international community to provide adequate, predictable, and flexible financing for humanitarian operations, alongside support for early recovery, livelihoods, essential services, and economic stabilization. Humanitarian assistance alone cannot resolve Yemen's crisis. Sustainable peace will require practical arrangements for economic recovery, institutional stabilization, and the restoration of essential public services. Lastly, attacks on commercial vessels in the Red Sea, Bab al-Mandab, and the Gulf of Aden threaten freedom of navigation, disrupt supply chains, and inflict global commodity costs. The strikes on Al-Makal port and the interception of an unmanned explosive vessel approaching its commercial berth prove this threat now directly affects and targets port in an infrastructure vital to Yemen's survival. Given Bab al-Mandab's strategic importance to Africa and global commerce, maritime security and Yemen's political stability are inseparable and must be addressed together. Madam President, there is no military solution to this conflict. The Yemeni people deserve peace, functioning institutions, and economic opportunities. The A3 calls on all parties to step back from escalation, return to dialogue, and engage constructively with the UN process. We stand ready to work with all members of this council to ensure it speaks to this moment with unity and urgency. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Liberia for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you to our briefers. On July 3rd, this council convened to address a blatant violation of Yemeni sovereignty. An Iranian flight into Sana'a conducted without the consent of the internationally recognized Yemeni government. Under the pretext of ferrying Houthi officials to the late Supreme Leader's funeral, this flight instead delivered IRGC personnel, including drone and missile experts, directly to the Houthi terrorists. These recent Houthi escalations reflect a systematic campaign to protect regional power and disrupt critical corridors. Since declaring navigation restrictions, Houthi forces have systematically targeted more than 7 Saudi-linked commercial vessels in the Red Sea, along with vital energy infrastructure in Yanbu, Jazan, and Abqaq. These attacks, together with Houthi drone strikes on some of Saudi Arabia's airports that injured civilians, demonstrate a coordinated effort to enforce a self-declared maritime embargo and dictate security dynamics around Ba al-Mandab. In addition, Houthis fired ballistic missiles and drones at territory held by Yemen's internationally recognized government, resulting in dozens of additional casualties over the past week. The link is crystal clear. The Houthis demonstrate active cooperation and alignment with Tehran. They engage in terrorist actions that increase instability in the region and threaten global commerce. The United States stands with the Republic of Yemen government against the Iran-supported Houthi terrorist threat. The United States also stands firmly with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in the face of the Houthi threat. We remain committed to regional stability and the free flow of commerce that underpins the global economy. We demand that the Houthis cease attacks against countries in the region and all actions which undermine freedom of navigation in the Red Sea. This includes attacks and threats against commercial vessels. Houthi activities risk drawing Yemen into a regional conflict that does not serve the interests of the Yemeni people. The path to stability in Yemen depends on depriving the Houthis of the resources for their terrorist activities. Resolution 2817 represented the international community's consensus that we cannot sit idly by as the Iranian regime and its proxies and partners undermine regional and international stability. The impact of Iran's failure to adhere to that resolution is all too clear today. Finally, the Houthis continue to unjustly detain more than 70 UN staff, along with humanitarian workers and other employees of civil society organizations and diplomatic missions, including the US mission. We reiterate our demand for their immediate and unconditional release. We also urge the UN to maintain any and all operations in Yemen outside of Houthi-controlled territory until the release of those who are unjustly detained. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Latvia.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Special Envoy Hans Grundberg and the Undersecretary General Tom Fletcher for their informative briefings. I also welcome the participation of the Permanent Representative of Yemen in today's meeting. Madam President, Latvia remains deeply concerned by the deteriorating security environment in and around Yemen, which has become an increasingly significant dimension of the broader regional escalation. We strongly condemn the renewed Houthis' threat and attacks against commercial shipping in the Red Sea, as well as attacks directed at the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and condemn Iran for its continued support of the Houthis, which enables and fuels these destabilizing actions. Moreover, violence is once again intensifying inside Yemen, with Houthi attacks targeting areas under Yemeni government control, resulting in further casualties. Such actions come at high cost. They erode the already fragile prospects for peace in Yemen, fuel regional instability, as well as jeopardize global freedom of navigation and maritime security. They also inflict a profound additional humanitarian and economic burden on Yemen and the wider region. We call on the Houthis to immediately halt all attacks and exercise maximum restraint. At this critical moment, every effort must be made to prevent Yemen from being pulled further into the widening regional conflict and to safeguard the narrow window for peace in Yemen. Madam President, at a time when escalating tensions risk further shrinking the space for diplomacy, steps that foster dialogue and confidence become all the more essential. The agreement on conflict-related detainees reached in May represented this rare opportunity to rebuild confidence between the parties and generate renewed momentum for the broader peace process. However, the process has yet to yield results, and the regional security situation risks further complicating implementation of the agreement. We urge the parties to honor the commitments they have undertaken and implement the agreed exchange without further delay. The continued arbitrary detention of United Nations, humanitarian, civil society, and diplomatic personnel by the Houthis remains deeply concerning, with many individuals having been held for several years already. These prolonged and unjust detentions inflict unacceptable suffering of the individuals detained and their families, while further impeding the international humanitarian efforts. Latvia reiterates its steadfast call for the immediate and unconditional release of all those who remain arbitrarily detained. Madam President, Yemen remains gripped by one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. As in many crises around the world, women and girls are disproportionately affected. Millions of women and girls face hunger and malnutrition, displacement, preventable maternal death, and heightened risks of gender-based violence, while access to even the most basic health services continues to erode. As needs continue to outpace resources, the cost of underfunding is measured in lives. The international community must step up its support, while all parties must guarantee humanitarian actors safe, independent, and unimpeded access to people in need across Yemen. Madam President, in conclusion, I would like to reiterate Latvia's unwavering commitment to the unity, sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Yemen. A lasting and sustainable peace can only emerge from an inclusive, Yemeni-led and UN-facilitated political process, one that brings together all relevant stakeholders and guarantees the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women. We welcome the historic appointment of Afrah al-Zoba as Yemen's first female foreign minister as an important step towards this goal. I would also like to express our strong support for the tireless efforts of the UN Special Envoy Hans Grundberg in advancing a peaceful resolution to the conflict, an endeavor that is all the more critical amid the current escalation and heightened risks. We call on all parties to turn away from further escalation and take a decisive step towards a different path, one that places the Yemeni people's security, dignity, and needs at the forefront. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Latvia for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Bahrain.
Madam President, allow me to thank Mr. Hans Grundberg, Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Yemen, Mr. Tom Fletcher, Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, for their valuable briefings. I also welcome the participation of the Permanent Representative of the Sisterly Republic of Yemen, His Excellency Ambassador Al-Saadi. The situation in Sisterly Yemen today clearly reflects what we have warned of over the past months, the widening scope of the regional conflict and its extension into Yemen. This is a result of the continued pursuit by the Iran-backed Houthi terrorist militia of foreign agendas at the expense of the lives, security, livelihoods, and future of the Yemeni people, as well as the security and stability of the region. The Kingdom of Bahrain condemns the militia's continued violation of the truce and its undermining of efforts to establish peace in Yemen. We also condemn the terrorist attacks launched on August 6 in Ma'rib and Hadramaut, killing and injuring civilians, including women and children, following the targeting of the Jawl Nasim camp in in Ma'rib, a site densely populated by displaced persons. We also condemn the repeated terrorist attacks carried out by the militia using ballistic missiles and drones since July 13. These attacks targeted civilian facilities and objects in the brotherly or sisterly kingdom of Saudi Arabia, injuring a number of civilians. We also condemn the militia's continued threats to the security and safety of maritime navigation and the freedom of international trade in Bab el-Mandeb Strait and the Red Sea, including its attacks on Saudi vessels. My country extends its sincere condolences and sympathy to the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, the Republic of Indonesia, and the families of the victims following the Houthi attack that targeted the commercial vessel Tihama in the Red Sea. We stress our full solidarity with the sisterly kingdom of Saudi Arabia in confronting these attacks. These assaults not only target its security and interests, but also pose a direct threat to the security and safety of maritime navigation and the freedom of international trade. This is a dangerous escalation that undermines the escalation and all efforts to achieve peace. We recall the press statement issued by the Council on August 7, which condemned the operation of unauthorized Iranian flights into Yemen, viewing them as a violation of Yemen's sovereignty. The statement also condemned the attacks against the sisterly kingdom of Saudi Arabia. We emphasize the need for the Security Council to adopt a clear and firm stance to protect the security and safety of maritime navigation and to hold accountable those responsible for attacks targeting vessels and shipping lanes. We stress that freedom of navigation in vital waterways, such as Bab el-Mandeb and the Strait of Hormuz, is a fundamental principle of international law that must not be compromised. We warn that turning a blind eye to these attacks will embolden the perpetrators to continue their actions and threats, thereby exacerbating instability and exposing regional security and international trade to further risks. The Kingdom of Bahrain expresses its deep concern regarding the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Yemen and calls for ensuring unhindered humanitarian access to all those in need. We reiterate our condemnation of the detention of UN, international and humanitarian organization personnel and call for their immediate release. We stress our support for the Presidential Leadership Council led by Dr. Rashad Mohammed Al-Alimi and for the legitimate Yemeni state institutions in their efforts to achieve economic stability and meet the needs of the citizens. We stress our solidarity with the sisterly Republic of Yemen and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. We stress our support for the measures they take to safeguard their sovereignty, security, and stability. We call for a firm international stance to hold the terrorist Houthi militia accountable and to cut off their sources of funding and armament, thereby protecting civilians and preserving regional security and stability. In conclusion, we renew our full support for the efforts of the Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Yemen, Mr. Grundberg. We emphasize the importance of serious and constructive engagement in the political process to reach a comprehensive and sustainable political solution to the Yemeni crisis in accordance with the 3 terms of reference, namely the Gulf Initiative and its implementation mechanism, the outcomes of the Comprehensive National Dialogue Conference, and UN Security Council Resolution 2216. Such a solution must preserve the sovereignty, unity, territorial integrity, and independence of the Republic of Yemen and fulfill the aspirations of the brotherly Yemeni people for security, stability, peace, and prosperity. Thank you, Madam President.
For the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Madam President. I would also like to thank Special Envoy Hans Grundberg and USG Tom Fletcher for their briefings. Madam President, Pakistan is deeply concerned by the recent developments in Yemen. The country today faces a serious risk of sliding back into widespread conflict that could reverse the relative calm that has prevailed since the UN brokered truce of April 2022. The gains made since the truce, howsoever fragile, must not be allowed to unravel. We are particularly concerned by recent Houthi attacks and reported civilian casualties in Al-Hudaydah, Marib, Hadramaut, and elsewhere. Escalation would only inflict more suffering on the Yemeni people and further narrow the space for diplomacy. Pakistan condemns in the strongest terms the Houthi missile and drone attacks and threats against the brotherly kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Such provocative actions pose a grave threat to regional peace and stability. Pakistan stands in solidarity with Saudi Arabia and reaffirms its unwavering support for the kingdom's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and peace and prosperity. We also strongly condemn the Houthi attacks against commercial shipping in the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden and Bab el-Mandeb, including the 11th August attack on commercial vessel Tihama, which tragically resulted in the deaths of 3 Pakistani crew members and 1 Indonesian crew member, and injuries to 7 others. Such actions threaten regional security, undermine freedom of navigation, and jeopardize uninterrupted flow of global commerce. The safety and security of international maritime shipping and protection of seafarers must be respected in accordance with international law. Pakistan reiterates its strong condemnation of the continued arbitrary detention of UN humanitarian and diplomatic personnel by the Houthis and call for their immediate and unconditional release. Yemen's acute humanitarian needs must also remain at the forefront of this Council's attention. Renewed fighting, economic disruption, and food insecurity would further aggravate the humanitarian situation. The international community must urgently address funding shortfalls. Madam President, looking at the current trajectory, de-escalation and resumption of a credible political process have assumed more urgency. De-escalation was the key word in the 2 briefings that we have received this morning. Special Envoy called for security and economic de-escalation, while Under-Secretary General Fletcher drew attention to urgency of de-escalation and proactive action on the humanitarian side. We appreciate the efforts of the UN Special Envoy to engage Yemeni parties, regional actors, and international partners, and to explore practical avenues for de-escalation. Pakistan echoes the Special Envoy's call for maximum restraint and urges all parties to halt actions that could trigger further military escalation and to engage in good faith negotiations under the auspices of the United Nations. A Yemeni-led and Yemeni-owned political process facilitated by the UN, grounded in full respect for Yemen's unity, sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity, remains the only viable path towards a comprehensive and sustainable settlement. The people of Yemen have endured years of conflict and immense suffering. They should not be made to bear the consequences of another cycle of regional and domestic escalation. At this critical juncture, every effort must be aimed at restoring conditions conducive for a political process. And for that, you need the political will that was also highlighted by the Special Envoy, a political process for a durable and peaceful settlement. Pakistan will continue to support all sincere efforts aimed at achieving that objective. I thank you.
Statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Colombia.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, Madam President. Colombia thanks Special Envoy Hans Grundberg and Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs Tom Fletcher for the information they have provided. Moreover, we welcome the presence of the Permanent Representative of Yemen. Madam President, Colombia is following the developing situation in Yemen with grave concern, a situation in which the continuation of violence is having a devastating impact on the civilian population. The combination of a sustained economic crisis, worsening living conditions, food insecurity, and a lack of access to basic services has forced millions of people to depend on humanitarian assistance to meet their most basic needs. Faced with this outlook, it is essential to ensure safe, rapid, and unhindered humanitarian access, as well as to mobilize the resources needed to respond to a crisis whose dimensions continue to grow. The growing volatility of the regional context adds an additional element of concern. Yemen cannot continue to be affected by outside dynamics which threaten to reverse the scant progress achieved in attempting to limit the violence. A further escalation would further complicate efforts aimed at reaching a political solution which is led by the Yemenis themselves. It would also exacerbate the humanitarian situation and would jeopardize the security of navigation in the Red Sea. Colombia calls for full compliance with commitments that have previously been made, including those derived from the Stockholm Agreement. In that framework, we reiterate the need to ensure the release of all persons that have been arbitrarily detained, in particular United Nations personnel. Their deprivation of liberty is affecting the rollout of humanitarian operations and contravenes obligations under international law. Finally, Colombia urges progress in coming up with concrete, confidence-building measures that would help improve humanitarian access, reduce tensions, and generate a conducive environment for the resumption of a sustainable political process that responds to the legitimate aspirations of the Yemeni people. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Of Colombia for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank Special Envoy Hans Grundberg and Undersecretary General Tom Fletcher for their briefings. I also welcome the participation of the Permanent Representative of Yemen in today's meeting. Madam President, Greece remains deeply concerned by the recent military escalation in and around Yemen, including continued attacks against commercial shipping in the Red Sea and the increasing use of military force by the Houthis against Yemeni forces and neighboring states. Recent Houthi missile and drone attacks risk further destabilizing Yemen and threaten to draw the country further into broader regional confrontation and to undermine efforts towards a political settlement. We condemn in the strongest terms the continued attacks against the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, including those targeting its territory and critical civilian and energy infrastructure. Such attacks are unacceptable and pose a serious threat to regional peace and security. We call on the Houthis to cease all attacks, respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of neighboring states, and comply fully with international law and relevant Security Council resolutions. Madam President, freedom of navigation is a fundamental principle of international law and must be respected by all. Greece strongly condemns the continued Houthi attacks against international shipping and the grave risks they pose to seafarers, commercial vessels, and global maritime trade. The security of navigation in the Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, and the Gulf of Aden is a matter of critical international importance. Developments in the Red Sea cannot be viewed in isolation from the wider challenges to maritime security across the region, including in the Strait of Hormuz. Greece reiterates that freedom of navigation and the right of passage through international straits, including the right of transit passage, where applicable, must be fully respected in accordance with international law, including UNCLOS. International straits must remain open and accessible to international shipping without discrimination, unlawful restrictions, or interference with the exercise of navigational rights. At the same time, maritime security cannot be separated from the broader political and humanitarian situation in Yemen. Further military escalation will not resolve the underlying conflict. On the contrary, it risks reversing the progress achieved since the 2022 truce and further aggravating an already dire humanitarian situation. Greece remains firmly committed to safeguarding freedom of navigation, including through its active support for EU Naval Force Operation Aspides, in accordance with its defensive mandate and international law. Madam President, Greece strongly supports the efforts of the UN Special Envoy towards a comprehensive and sustainable political settlement through an inclusive, Yemeni-led and Yemeni-owned process under UN auspices, with full respect for Yemen's unity, sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. We call on all parties to engage constructively and in good faith with the Special Envoy. There can be no military solution to this conflict. We also welcome the appointment of Yemen's first woman Minister for Foreign Affairs, Dr. Afra Al-Zuba. This represents an important milestone for women's participation in Yemen's political and public life. The full, equal, meaningful, and safe participation of women at all levels of decision-making, including in the political process, is indispensable to sustainable peace. Madam President, the humanitarian situation remains deeply alarming. The international community must ensure that assistance reaches those most in need. We therefore echo the call on donors to provide adequate, timely, flexible, and predictable humanitarian funding to address urgent needs and prevent further deterioration. Humanitarian personnel must be able to operate safely and without obstruction. We reiterate our call for the immediate and unconditional release of all United Nations humanitarian and civil society personnel detained by the Houthis. Their safety, security, and freedom of movement must be respected, and humanitarian access must remain unhindered. In conclusion, Madam President, the message of the international community must remain clear and united. Freedom of navigation and international shipping must be respected and must never be held hostage to political or military objectives. The Houthis must not jeopardize maritime security in the Red Sea, must not drag Yemen into a wider regional conflict, and must not undermine efforts towards a sustainable political settlement. Greece will continue to support the efforts of the United Nations and the international community towards a peaceful, stable, and prosperous Yemen. A durable solution can only be political. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank Special Envoy Grundberg and USG Fletcher for their briefings, and I welcome the permanent representative of Yemen to this meeting. Over the past month or so, the situation in Yemen has escalated sharply, with the intensity of the conflict reaching its highest level since the ceasefire agreement was signed in April 2022. Large-scale clashes have occurred in Hodeidah, Marib, Hadramawt, and other areas, causing significant casualties. Meanwhile, security risks along the Red Sea shipping routes have increased, causing widespread international concern. The most urgent task is to de-escalate the situation and prevent the conflict from further escalation. All parties involved should remain calm and exercise restraint to avoid further escalation. The current escalation in Yemen comes amid growing instability across the Middle East and is the result of the spillover effects of regional conflicts. The crises that have unfolded in the Middle East over the past 3 years are by no means isolated. To properly address the Yemeni issue, we must view it in a broader context of the Middle East, adopt a comprehensive approach to help de-escalate tensions across the region. To this end, I would like to make 4 points. First, we must promote peaceful coexistence among countries. Middle Eastern countries are inextricably linked and are permanent neighbors. Conflict and instability serve no country's interests. Israel and all relevant parties should fully implement the ceasefire agreement to achieve a genuine and a lasting ceasefire in Gaza. The international community should step up mediation, urge the U.S. and Iran to resume implementing the consensus reached in the MOU, creating conditions to resolve regional hotspot issues. We must support regional countries in pursuing dialogue to improve their mutual relations and to build a new regional security architecture that is suited to evolving circumstances. Second, we must fully respect the sovereignty of all countries. Sovereign equality is a fundamental norm of the UN Charter. All countries in the region are equal members of the international community. Their sovereignty, independence, security, and territorial integrity must be fully respected, and the safety of their personnel, facilities, and institutions safeguarded. The Yemeni issue must be resolved through a Yemeni-led and owned process. China supports dialogue and negotiations by all Yemeni parties to resume and steadily advance the comprehensive political process so as to achieve internal reconciliation at an early date. China supports Special Envoy Grundberg in continuing his mediation role. Third, we must firmly uphold international rule of law. The authority of international law lies in its consistent application. It cannot be applied when convenient and discarded when not, nor should the law of the jungle dictate the fates of regional countries. The international community must jointly oppose the use of force without Security Council authorization. When addressing hotspot issues, the Council must maintain an objective and balanced stance and play a constructive role. Freedom of navigation through international straits bears on the well-being of all countries, and safe and unimpeded passage through the Strait of Hormuz must be ensured. Civilians and the civilian infrastructure must not be targeted. This fundamental principle of international law must be observed. Fourth, we must advance development and security in a coordinated manner. Development underpins security. Without sustainable development, there can be no sustainable security. Yemen is facing one of the world's largest, longest, and most severe humanitarian crises, and the international community must take urgent action. China commends the work of USG Fletcher to this end. China recently provided a new batch of food aid to Yemen and called on all parties to increase humanitarian and development assistance for Yemen to prevent large-scale famine. The Houthi armed group should immediately and unconditionally release detained UN personnel and create favorable conditions for the UN to resume humanitarian assistance. President, China is a true friend of the Yemeni people and firmly supports Yemen in safeguarding its sovereignty and territorial integrity and pursuing peace and development. Together with the international community, we will continue to make unremitting efforts to promote a political solution to the Yemeni issue and restoring lasting peace in the region. I thank you, Chair. I thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Madam President, we thank the Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Yemen, Mr. Hans Grundberg, and Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Head of OCHA, Mr. Tom Fletcher, for their briefings. We are following with growing concern the situation in Yemen. Today, it is facing the most acute military-political crisis since the internal truce was concluded in April 2022. Everything began with the landing of civilian aircraft in Sana'a on the 3rd of July and in Hodeidah on the 13th of July. These were incidents that, in and of themselves, did not lead to any human casualties or material damage. Of course, those flights should have been agreed in advance with the official Yemeni authorities. However, the very harsh reaction to them from the Arab coalition in the form of bombings of the runway at Sana'a International Airport seems excessive, particularly given the civilian and humanitarian significance of this air hub for the Yemeni people. After this, the Ansar Allah movement resorted to the use of force again, including rocket attacks on the territory of Saudi Arabia. The Arab coalition forces, in turn, responded by bombing Houthi-controlled parts of Yemen, including Sana'a, Ad-Dali, and Sada. In this context, the military situation on the contact line has also worsened, with clashes in Marib, Taiz, and Hadramat provinces. We hope that the belligerents will nevertheless be able to show wisdom and refrain from further scaling up military activities, because the continuation of this current trend could have far-reaching consequences for the entire region. We call upon them to return to the negotiating table as soon as possible and to begin discussing their disagreements through diplomatic means. After more than 6 months of calm, there is renewed turbulence in the Red Sea, where Ansar Allah has attempted to block the navigation of commercial and military ships, explaining their actions as a mirror reaction to the years-long blockade of the northern provinces of Yemen. Unfortunately, there were human casualties. We agree on the need to unconditionally ensure the freedom of maritime navigation, and we roundly condemn any acts that represent a danger to commercial shipping. Madam President, the events surrounding Yemen unambiguously confirm the danger of this conflict remaining unresolved. We have witnessed how the long lack of progress in the Yemeni peace process forced the Houthis to become dragged into a regional confrontation initiated by the USA and Israel against the Islamic Republic of Iran. At the same time, we are convinced that even in these circumstances, the Yemenis do nevertheless have a chance to overcome their internal divisions. International mediation by the Special Envoy of the Secretary-General should now make every effort to immediately resume negotiations on the Yemeni settlement roadmap, to formalize the agreements therein, and to launch a fully-fledged political process. Achieving success in this will only be possible through dialogue, taking into account the fair interests of all of the leading political forces in the country, including Ansar Allah. At the same time, it's important to consistently overcome the parties' antagonism and to curb their bellicose rhetoric. The idea of exerting maximum pressure on any of the parties has long proven to be ineffective in the Yemeni context. For our part, we will continue to provide support for this in the context of our contacts with all Yemeni protagonists and key regional actors. We call upon responsible world powers to similarly support the Yemenis instead of attaching additional conditions to the launch of a political process in the country. We also recall the need for the eventual updating of the normative and legal basis for the Yemeni settlement. Madam President, we highlight the need for coordinated efforts by the global community on the humanitarian track in Yemen. As we heard from the briefers today, in the light of the escalation of the conflict and the growing needs among vulnerable population groups, the amount of humanitarian assistance is, on the contrary, falling. Vital areas such as food security, medical services remain underfunded. We call upon the international community and donors to pay close attention to this and to not discriminate based on geography. We also call for the full lifting of the maritime, air and land blockade of Yemen and the lifting of all restrictions on the delivery of food, medicines and other essential goods to the country. We also recall our support for the efforts of the World Organization's leadership to ensure the release of detained UN and humanitarian personnel. Thank you for your attention.
Thank the representative of the Russian Federation for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Madam President, I wish first and foremost to thank Special Envoy of the Secretary-General, Mr. Hans Grundberg, and Mr. Tom Fletcher, Under Secretary-General, for their briefings. I also welcome the permanent representative of Yemen to the Chamber. Yemen is currently witnessing the most dire escalation of tensions since the truce of 2022. That has been said. Responsibility for that falls squarely and entirely on Houthi shoulders. They've stepped up their attacks against the Yemeni government and Saudi Arabia, and these attacks have produced several victims and destroyed civilian infrastructure. We condemn the resumption of Houthi attacks in the Red Sea. These were described in the letter of the 10th of August addressed by the Secretary-General to this Council. Other attacks have followed suit. The day before yesterday, yet again on the 11th of August, strikes against the Tiama cargo ship claimed the lives of several crew members, including Pakistani and Indonesian nationals. We convey our condolences to their families and to Pakistan and Indonesia. France condemns these attacks in the strongest terms. We express our support for and solidarity with Yemen and Saudi Arabia. These attacks are a grave violation of regional security, as well as the freedom of navigation and maritime security. This Council called for respect of these principles in Resolution 2722. The Houthis must put an immediate and unconditional end to these acts. France will continue to remain engaged to ensure maritime security as part of the European operation EU Navifor Aspides. We're doing this in full compliance with international law, with a strictly defensive posture and alongside our European and international partners. President, the escalation in Yemen began on the 3rd of July when an Iranian aircraft touched down in Sana'a without the agreement of the legitimate authorities. That was a direct attack on Yemen's sovereignty. This act is one expression of Iran's destabilizing behavior in the region. These actions must cease immediately and definitively. By supporting the Houthis, Tehran is fueling this crisis and neglecting its obligations pursuant to the arms embargo established in Resolution 2216. France expects that Iran will comply with its international obligations and cease all transfers of military equipment to the Houthis. We issued that very same demand during the emergency meeting of the Council on the 13th of July. Moreover, we are seeing consistent and deliberate impediments placed by the Houthis on humanitarian action. France demands the immediate and unconditional release of all United Nations personnel, workers for non-governmental organizations and personnel in diplomatic missions that have been arbitrarily detained by the Houthis. These detentions, just like attacks against humanitarian personnel, run counter to international humanitarian law, Resolution 2730, and international human rights law. Moreover, these detentions hinder the delivery of aid that the civilian population urgently needs. Madam President, there is no military solution to the conflict in Yemen. France fully supports the legitimate government and its efforts to guarantee the country's security and safety. We fully support the action of Special Envoy Hans Grundberg. Only an inclusive political process led under the aegis of the United Nations, and one which brings on board women and the whole of Yemeni society, will put an end to this crisis. France calls upon all actors to engage in such a process in good faith. Thank you.
Of France for the statement, and I shall now make a statement in my capacity as representative of Denmark. And let me start by thanking Special Envoy Grundberg and Undersecretary General Fletcher for their briefings. I'll make 4 points. First, Denmark is deeply alarmed by the recent escalation in and around Yemen. We condemn in the strongest terms the Houthi attacks on commercial vessels in the Red Sea, as well as those against Saudi Arabia and several Yemeni provinces. These are unprovoked attacks. The Houthis' actions undermine efforts to secure peace in Yemen and risk to further destabilize the wider region. Denmark also condemns Iran's support to proxies, including to the Houthis. As mentioned by Special Envoy Grundberg, further hostilities also bring serious economic and humanitarian consequences to the people of Yemen and across the region. We call for de-escalation and the use of all existing channels of dialogue to reduce tensions. Second, we deplore the resumption of Houthi attacks against commercial shipping in the Red Sea and denounce the attack that caused the death of several seafarers earlier this week. Maritime security and freedom of navigation in the Red Sea must be fully restored in line with international law and relevant Security Council resolutions. Denmark remains committed to protecting the freedom of navigation in one of the world's most critical waterways, to the benefit of global trade and development. Third, this military escalation is deepening the humanitarian suffering of the Yemeni people. Food insecurity is acute, as Undersecretary General Fletcher has highlighted, with over 53% of Yemenis experiences severe food insecurity. Families are forced to make impossible choices as hunger deepens and resilience erodes. We call for urgent steps to address humanitarian needs and help to close the funding gap in Yemen's humanitarian response plans. Beyond funding concerns, continued restrictions on movement and safety concerns have left many Yemenis districts uncovered by active humanitarian programming. Denmark reiterates its urgent call for safe and unhindered humanitarian access. We reiterate our condemnation of Houthi detentions of staff from the UN, NGOs, civil society, and diplomatic missions, and call for their immediate and unconditional release. Fourth and finally, Denmark believes that peaceful and prosperous societies require genuine inclusion, and Yemen is no exception. Broad representation from diverse Yemeni factions, including civil society, women, youth, and all political constituencies, is essential to achieve sustainable peace. We call for a Yemeni-led and truly inclusive peace process that must build on the meaningful participation of all Yemenis, as also highlighted by Special Envoy Grundberg, and we express our full support to his efforts. We therefore deeply regret, and we are generally surprised, to have experienced strong opposition to a civil society briefer today, Tawakkol Kaman, who we are certain would have offered a valuable perspective on how to advance the prospects of an inclusive political settlement. This requires revitalizing the peace process, justice and accountability for crimes committed during the conflict, and empowering women and youth as core decision makers. I now resume my functions as President of the Council, and I now give the floor to the representative of Yemen.
السيد الرئيس، أود في البداية أن أهنئكم السفيرة كريستينا ووفدكم الصديق على رئاستكم لهذا المجلس في هذا الشهر، متمنيا لكم ولوفدكم الصديق.
I wish to congratulate Denmark on assuming the presidency of the Council. I thank your predecessor, the permanent representative of the DRC, for their commendable presidency of the Council last month. We have taken note of the briefing by Hans Grundberg, the Special Envoy, and we thank Tom Fletcher for his insights. I wish to express our solidarity with the government and people of Colombia following the devastating earthquake 2 days ago, and we wish to extend our sincerest condolences to the families of the victims. We wish speedy recovery to all injured. We convene at a delicate and pivotal juncture in the history of Yemen following weeks of dangerous and rapid escalations waged by the terrorist Houthi militias, threatening to drag Yemen back into a spiral of conflict and undermine the opportunities of peace which we have invested in alongside the United Nations, this August Council, and sisterly states for the past years. For more than a decade, the Yemeni government has paid the Yemeni people has paid a daunting price due to the war waged by the terrorist Houthi militias against our people. Without a shadow of a doubt, this tragedy was not preordained by fate, but rather was the outcome of the coup waged by the Houthi militias, which have chosen chaos and war over the stability of the state, sectarianism over equal citizenship, and they have chosen to bet on the agendas of the Iranian regime to the detriment of the Yemeni people and its aspiration for security, stability, and dignity. These militias have only brought more destruction and division to Yemen. They have undermined state institutions, targeted the national economy, recruited thousands of children, plundered resources and assistance, and resorted to arbitrary detention and gross human rights violations. President, we witness today violent escalations by the Houthi militias. And they have attempted to establish an air bridge between Sana'a and Tehran to transfer weapons and experts through the IRGC-affiliated Mahan Air, designated on the sanctions list. They have targeted commercial vessels in the Red Sea and Bab el-Mandeb Strait, They have targeted the civilians in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and they've used UAVs and ballistic missiles to target the outposts of armed forces, civilian infrastructure, and displacement camps. They have targeted Al-Makha port and vital civilian infrastructure. On Tuesday, they have waged a terrorist attack against Tahama vessel used for trade and the provision of food supplies to the Yemeni people. They have killed 4 crew members, including 3 Pakistanis and an Indonesian sailor. 4 others were injured. A fire broke out aboard and the vessel was damaged. These Houthi militias once again targeted the vessel with another missile following the arrival of rescuers for the evacuation of the injured. This has led to the wounding of one of the rescuers in a deliberate attack targeting a rescue operation. This once again revealed the disregard of the Houthis for the lives of rescuers and crew members, as well as their disregard for the norms and rules governing maritime navigation. This proves that the Houthi militias have pursued a systematic war against the assets of the Yemeni people, its lifelines and economic ports. This demonstrates the danger of keeping UAV and missile and weapon capacities outside the control of state institutions. And here lies a paradox that can no longer be ignored. These militias have propagated for years allegations of a blockade to circumvent their responsibility for the worsening living conditions for the Yemeni people. These militias target today the ports of Yemen, its vital infrastructure. They also target commercial and merchant vessels, as well as food supplies. They disrupt economic and commercial activity and worsen the suffering of the Yemeni people. And they have the ones who have turned the territory of Yemen as a platform to serve the IRGC agenda and to blackmail the international community and threaten international trade and navigation. They are the ones who have undermined efforts for peace and prolonged the crisis, dragging Yemen into more destruction, tension, and instability. President, the government of Yemen has welcomed the statement made by the Security Council on Yemen, including its condemnation of the unauthorized Iranian flights, which constituted a violation of the sovereignty of Yemen, landing in Sana'a and Hodeidah airports without authorization from our government. We welcome the condemnation of attacks by Houthis against civilian infrastructure in the KSA as well as commercial vessels. We welcome the commitment by the Security Council to the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Yemen. We welcome the fact that the Council reaffirmed that all flights must be subject to coordination with the government of Yemen with prior authorization. And we welcome its reaffirmation of the need to commit to international law and relevant Security Council resolutions, including 2216. However, subsequent developments raise a fundamental question. How can the international community and this august Council translate these principles into concrete measures that preserve efforts for peace and prevent the recurrence of such violations? We call upon the international community and the Security Council to build on this position. Condemnation, despite being important, must be coupled with implementation of relevant resolutions, including 2140 and 2216. It must also be coupled with efforts to prevent the smuggling of weapons and military expertise to the Houthi militias, including holding perpetrators accountable for violations of the sanction regime. The continuous possession of these weapons and technologies by Houthi militias run counter to the requirements of sustainable peace and constitute a permanent threat to Yemen, neighboring countries, and international waterways. This requires a shift from mere condemnation to attempts to address its sources and means.
The behavior of the Houthi militias over the past years reveals a consistent pattern of evading the obligations of peace by manufacturing crises and external confrontations. The Houthi militias attempt to divert attention away from the core of the Yemeni issue, and today this approach is no longer limited to simply avoiding national obligations. Rather, it's become a permanent means of blackmailing the regional international community and creating successive crises so as to gain time and to impose new realities on the ground by force. However, these attempts will not change the fact that peace in Yemen requires addressing the roots of this conflict, ending the coup, restoring state institutions, and complying with the will of the Yemeni people, as well as the agreed-upon political framework of reference to resolve the conflict. Madam President, the state will continue to extend a hand towards every sincere effort that would lead to a peace that is genuine, sustainable, and just, that ends the coup, that restores state institutions, and that safeguards the dignity of all Yemenis and achieves the security, stability, and peace that the Yemenis deserve. Here, the Presidential Leadership Council and the Yemeni government reaffirm their commitment to peace and to positive engagement with all regional and international initiatives and efforts that aim to end the war and alleviate the suffering of Yemenis. We stress that the peace we desire is one that addresses the roots of the crisis, that resolves the causes of the war, that restores the authority of the state and its institutions, that protects the rights, freedoms, and equal citizenship and the rule of law. A peace that would ensure the state's exclusive monopoly over weapons and legitimate means of force. A peace that respects the sovereignty of the Republic of Yemen, the security of neighboring states, and international maritime routes. We do not seek a peace that grants militias another opportunity to regenerate themselves and to prepare for a new cycle of conflict. We once again affirm that the intransigence of the Houthi militias and their repeated rejection of all calls and initiatives aimed at resolving the Yemeni crisis reveal their lack of seriousness regarding a comprehensive political settlement, and they insist instead on continuing the war, on shedding Yemeni blood, and on perpetuating the suffering of the Yemeni people. We also affirm that this state will no longer accept this continuation of this policy of blackmail and threats and intimidation. We will not allow the decision for war or peace to be usurped or permit the course of events to be dictated onto it to the Yemenis or to regional and international peace and security. The stability of Yemen is fundamental for the security and stability of the region and the world, for the safety of international navigation and global trade, and the protection of global supply chains. It is important for the reduction of terrorism and organized crime, and for curbing irregular migration, and for preserving the principles of international law that are based on respect for state sovereignty. This cannot be achieved without a peace process that is founded on bold political steps that affirm that there is no future for any group that challenges the Yemeni state's exclusive authorities, retains weapons outside state institutions, or claims for itself a political or divine or religious or hereditary right that supersedes the will of the Yemeni people and the rule of law. Madam President, the government of Yemen continues to implement its program of economic, financial, and administrative reforms. We continue to improve the efficiency of public institutions, to enhance transparency, develop resources, address imbalances, and strengthen the independence of oversight bodies and improve the investment climate. This is coupled with the unification of security and military decision-making circles and empowering state institutions to undertake their responsibilities across all the governorates of the state, as this is the only true guarantee of lasting security and stability. The government is also working on resuming all exports and restoring the state's sovereign revenue so that they can be directed to serve the Yemeni people. Foremost among these priorities is meeting the basic obligations of the state, paying the salaries, improving services, and supporting economic stability. We also are working to ensure that Yemen's wealth benefits all Yemenis rather than remaining hostage to the threats and extortion of the militias. The institutions of the state would not have been able to remain resilient and able to fulfill their obligations without the sincere, fraternal support of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and its continued support, political, economic, and humanitarian. This support has helped preserve the cohesion of Yemeni state institutions. It has alleviated the suffering of the Yemeni people and has funded and implemented vital projects and strengthened prospects for recovery at all levels. We renew our call to Yemen's development partners and to donor organizations and funds, a call to provide urgent and sustainable support that will assist the government in achieving economic stability, strengthening the prospects of recovery, alleviating humanitarian suffering, while reaffirming the government's commitment to continued close coordination with donors and international partners to improve support mechanisms and enhance their effectiveness. Madam President, in the humanitarian context, the Yemeni government has demonstrated its commitment to cooperate in order to ensure the success of the agreement reached under UN auspices for the release of 1,600 prisoners and detainees. This is an important humanitarian step and confidence-building measure that would have alleviated the suffering of thousands of Yemeni families and opened a pathway towards progress in the peace process. However, the Houthi militias have reneged on their commitments. They've obstructed the implementation of the agreement as part of their pattern of politicizing humanitarian issues and using them as tools for bargaining and blackmail. They do this as they continue to arbitrarily detain UN personnel, humanitarian workers, civil society members, and diplomatic mission staff in defiance of the demands of this Council and the international community. The government of Yemen condemns these practices and calls on the Security Council to exert genuine pressure to ensure the implementation of the agreement to release the detainees and prisoners, to secure the immediate, safe, and unconditional release of all United Nations employees, humanitarian personnel, and other persons who have been arbitrarily detained, and to stop using humanitarian issues as political bargaining chips. In closing, Madam President, allow me to quote His Excellency Dr. Rashad Al-Alibi, the chairman of the Presidential Leadership Council, and I quote, "Our friends have asked us for years to give peace a chance. We have done so with a sense of responsibility, and we have gone even beyond what was expected of us out of care for Yemeni lives. Today, we ask our friends and this esteemed council to give the state a chance as well." End quote. We are not asking this council to simply show solidarity with the Yemeni government. We are asking this council to defend the principles that concern the entire world order: the protection of civilians, the respect for state sovereignty, the sanctity of civilian facilities and commercial ports, the protection of the freedom of navigation, the rejection of the use of missiles and drones to impose political and economic gains by force. Our choice will remain that for a just and sustainable peace that restores state institutions, that preserves the dignity of Yemenis, and that brings security and stability to Yemen and the region. I thank you, Madam President.
No more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.